think it's extremely healthy, and we've seen that throughout church history. I mean, that was part of the creeds, the Apostles' Creed, the
Yeah.
Nicene Creed. I mean, we have similar to those things. I mean, again, if I was pressed on it, I would say something like, if I'm drawing a circle around who is and who isn't a Christian in that sense, per their beliefs, I would even take it back to not something like the Chicago or the Lausanne Covenant. I would take it back to the creeds. I would say, let's look at the creeds and see, do you agree with those? Again, not because they're scripture, not because they're inerrant, but because they're a summation of scriptural truths, and that's kind of where I would start.
Action though so you can look at what the creeds are and affirm them, which I think is great. There's like the Nicene, the Apostles' Creed, right, and others, but they always also reflect like the particular theological controversies of that time too.
Right, exactly.
And I'd say part of the Christian tradition is sitting down across differences and trying to work out what we can agree with each other on.
Oh yeah, totally.
And so there's a value that they did that. Like I say, it's kind of anti-fundamentalist in a lot of ways. It's trying to actually see what is our common ground that we can actually work together across. And so now here's like a contrast, I think, though, that's important. And when we talk about what's frustrating about the American church, some people learn about Lausanne Covenant in seminary, right? If you're in South America, every missions organization actually has that as their belief statement. I mean, if you talk to Christians across the world, they know about it. Americans just tend to be entirely disconnected from this very recent history. We don't even know about it. And so there is a certain amount of just disconnection from history. And a lot of historians have even called it anti-intellectualism. And it traces back, once again, to the fundamentalist modernist divide. Like the modernists kind of took academia and the university and science with them. And those that were really faithful to more of a historical understanding of Christianity, at least in the United States, largely abandoned those things.
Yeah.
Or created their alternate versions of it.
Right.
And so then we got kind of locked into that checker game when there was a larger chess game to play.
Yeah.
And a better way to go about this. And I think that was a real mistake. And there's an opportunity, I think, for us to kind of reclaim these historical points to actually see what actually is it that Christians have actually thought and believed about this and what haven't. And I mean, there's other parts that are once again, very idiosyncratic to American Christianity and are kind of weird when you actually kind of start to get more of a global view and a historical view. I mean, another one of them is the particular form of young earth creationism that we see here.
Yes.
It's very particular. And this is something I didn't understand. And once again, the part of the reason why it's been so powerful is because we've been disconnected from history, right?
Right, exactly.
So I didn't realize, I mean, I was born in 1978. And I think actually there's a fairly large number of young earth creationists across the globe. I mean, a large part of my family as Indians were young earth creationists and even are now. But it's a different type of young earth creationism.
How so? Because this is fascinating, and I think the audience will really appreciate this. So what was different between the young earth creationism of America and your family, your circle, young earth creationism?
Well, I mean, it wasn't science oriented. Really at all. It was just like they picked up scripture and they read it. It just really seemed like Adam and Eve are recent, and so they believe that. And it just wasn't as important. Like that's what most of them believe. But it just wasn't that important.
Right.
And there wasn't like this big effort to form scientific arguments around it or what have you. And then there's all this theology caught up in young earth creationism that I just never encountered before. And it was just weird for me, actually, as I started to get it more familiar with it. So, I mean, I was a young earth creationist, but it was also like bizarro world as I entered it and saying, wait a minute, where'd you get that from scripture? Great example of this is young earth creationists in at least leaders in young earth creationism in the United States subscribe to this really strange theology called no death before the fall, meaning that they don't think that before Adam and Eve fell, that there were any carnivores on Earth,
right?
And that everything was a vegetarian. That basically, God made lions, but the lions that were there were all vegetarians. Is kind of what they believe. And then somehow, for when Adam and Eve fell, that caused like a corruption in the natural order, so that all of a sudden eagles start to eat fish, and like wolves start to eat other
Rabbits
animals.
and yeah.
Yeah, so that's what they thought. Okay,
Yep.
now we can talk about where they get that historically. I mean, it's not actually that hard to follow historically. I mean, it's just a very recent view that actually arises out of Seventh-day Adventism in the Second Great Awakening in like the 1800s. It's incredibly idiosyncratic to them because there's really no one before them that holds that view.
Right.
And then it ends up becoming a really key plank in explaining the theological problems of evolution, which fundamentalists have decided they disagree with, and rejecting an old Earth. Except for, while most of the people internationally are Young Earth many of them are Young Earth Creationists. I'll tell you, it's not that important to them. You kind of give them a different way to look at things and suggest, hey, maybe there was, just look at Genesis 1 and 2. It talks about how the Spirit of the Lord is over the earth and the chaos there. So maybe God had made everything before, and this is like another creation. What happened? What was going on before that?
Right.
Like, oh, that's an interesting idea. Maybe the earth is old then. That's sort of like open-handedness, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't like this high intensity thing. It has to be young. Scripture forces us into that. It was just, that was like their initial impression, but it was a flexible thing. Well, you have to kind of start closing off all of these loopholes, quote unquote, in the text. And part of the way how you do that is start adopting theology and positions that aren't actually in Scripture. It's actually very hard to justify that from Scripture.
Right. Without making some extreme leaps, and even those you kind of scratch your head and say, what is actually going on here? So, I would agree.
But the thing about it is I wasn't acquainted with history, right? And so I didn't know that was the case until later. I was just kind of saying, like, well, where do you get that from Scripture? I don't get it. I'm not following. Can you show me that? And I couldn't get straight answers. I mean, because it really wasn't from Scripture. It was really their tradition. Right. But they were trying to claim that this is how everyone in Christianity has always seen it. The only reason people thought differently is because of evolution and everything like that. But that's just false. I mean, these things that you can actually test historically. Because, I mean, if you can find a person who thought differently, you find out the majority of Christians thought differently before Darwin, then you know that claim is false. It's not that people changed their views because of Darwin. It's that actually maybe you adopted that view as a reaction against Darwin. That's probably a better explanation.
Right. So, I mean, how much of this do you think is, because we see different time periods asking different questions and then getting different answers, and then there is theological development that kind of comes out of that. I think a significant example would be something like the deity of Christ and the Trinity. So oftentimes you'll go back to church fathers to kind of support your interpretation of biblical text when it comes to the deity of Christ. But I mean, if we're honest, it's scanty. It's there. The church fathers are talking about it, but it's not as developed as it was when Arian came along, because he was asking questions and he was proposing different interpretations or different understandings of Scripture than had been thought of previously. So then, people were saying, okay, well, let's go back to the text, let's look at the language, let's do all these things that we need to do in order to be able to answer these questions. And then they, came up with the, the theological formulation of kind of more of the doctrine. Do you see, like, I don't know, I guess for me, I see that as it kind of goes in these waves where then we ride the wave of Trinitarianism for a while. It's not really debated. It's kind of been a settled issue. But then we get on to other things, like in 1045, there's the split between the Orthodox tradition kind of comes out of that. The Eastern Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox kind of comes out of a split. Well, then they had to make, some more significant definitions for things, and more doctrine and dogma comes out of that. And then we have things like the Reformation and, in the 15th and 16th century. And so, again, more things have to kind of be understood and solidified, and more doctrine. And now here in the 21st century, we're dealing with other things like, Marxism and materialism and, kind of this postmodern viewpoint. And so now we're doing another set of, okay, this is what the text says and doctrine. Do you see, is that kind of the tradition, the history that you're seeing kind of happen? Or or is there something else going on?
Yeah, I would just say, like, what's our relationship to that history? I mean, I think that we don't necessarily have to agree with everything that the church fathers said. Like, they were all convinced that there was no one who living on the other side of the earth. I mean, they were okay with the idea of the earth being a globe, but they thought that there would, I mean, like, if you ask them, like, well, if we told them actually there's like another continent called America on the other side of the globe, and, you know, this gets covered by Augustine in City of God. Are there people that living there? And he would say, absolutely not. That would be in direct conflict with their faith. Now, all of us reject Augustine's view on that. Now, what I'd say by traditional Christianity, what I mean, or what I'm getting at, is not that we necessarily have to agree with everything that Augustine said, but rather that that we're really meant to be engaged in like this grand conversation of theology with the church across differences in our moment, both differences internal to the United States, differences across, between other cultures, and also differences to actually understand that we're part of a larger conversation. And to be part of that conversation, we have to know what people have been saying before.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And that's not really the current model of much of the American church, right? So, I mean, you've gone to seminary, right? And you studied some, or you didn't go to seminary. Well, that's great. I didn't go to seminary either, to be honest.
Yeah, I have an associate's degree in religious studies, but I don't have a master's degree. I don't have a BA or anything like that.
Well, I think that aspect of church history has been lost by a lot of Christians. Like I said, when you look at kind of the model of Christianity that is really dominating the United States, it tends to, let's see here. I mean, there's several things that are distinctive. I'm just trying to kind of list out some of them that might make some sense. I mean, like I said, it can be really oriented around comfort. It tends to really emphasize politics. It's actually very racially divided for the most part. It has just like a very particular set of concerns. It tends to be, at best, disconnected from academics. And when it is connected to academics, it tends to be in a very instrumental sort of way. So, like, people will be interested in a field for the purpose of proving their faith, or what have you, or bolstering their faith. It tends to be very instrumental, which is not. I mean, a lot of people would call that anti-intellectual. So even like the forms of intellectualism there are kind of anti-intellectual forms at times.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation that I had with Dr. Joshua Swamdass. Again, this is just a small portion of the conversation that he and I had. I'll be releasing more of that in the future, but I would invite you to like this video, subscribe to this channel if you're interested in seeing when those future videos come out. And also, I would love to invite you to our Dealing with Deconstruction Facebook group. It's a great place where we have conversations about topics that are interested to those who are questioning Christianity, to those who are pulling the different pieces out of Christianity and saying, is this true? Do I have to believe this? Is this a necessary belief of Christianity? And we talk about show topics and just have great fellowship and a great time. There are people from all walks of life in that group, people that are Christian, people that are not Christian, people that are in the process of deconstructing, people that have gone through the process and reconstructed. So I would invite you to join that group and join our community. We'll see you next time as we deal with deconstruction.